Hi, you are listening to Baachu Talk, a podcast for government services professionals. My name is Bhaskar, and I will be sitting down with our government services leaders to share their stories, discuss their career, and learn all about their values and collective impact in our society. Hi, today's guest is Professor Gary Sturgess. Professor Gary Sturgess is a leading expert on outsourcing and competition. He is New South Wales Premier Australian-New Zealand School of Government Chair of Public Service Delivery at the University of New South Wales and is an adjunct professor at Griffith University in Brisbane and Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. He consults extensively with various government departments. He also serves as a non-exec director on the Victorian Treasury Board and as a member of the Public Sector Renewal Board in the Queensland Government. He spent more than a decade in London, where he was exec director of the Serco Institute, a corporate think tank founded by public service multinational Serco plc, returning to take up his position with Australia-New Zealand School of Government in mid-2011. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, he was cabinet secretary in the New South Wales government under Premier Nick Greiner, and played a leading role in some of the innovative policy initiatives of the government, including the corporatization of government business enterprises, environmental markets, and the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Welcome to Baachu Talk, Gary. Great to have you with us.
Yes, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, Gary. Gary, I know we have been in touch for a long time. So let's start with your early life and career, Gary. Where were you born? And let's go back to the very, very beginning.
Yeah, so I was born in a regional centre of Queensland, in country Queensland, a town of about 100,000 people. But I grew up in a small country town further west. So small town boy.
Perfect, Gary. Did you do your schools, like your primary school, secondary school in the same area, Gary?
I did. I went to the local high school. I won a government scholarship and went to the University of Queensland in the capital of Queensland in Brisbane, and I studied law. It is important, to understand the sort of work I did for governments and with industry in the UK and my academic research. It is important to know that my father was a small businessman. He established an engine reconditioning workshop and then set up several other businesses selling spare parts. And that's important. And I've only sort of come to realise this in recent years, that I think I have always come at policy through the eyes of the people who deliver, through the eyes of people who manage.
And this company that your father started, Gary, do you still operate them, Gary? Engine Australia, is it?
I'm the chairman of the company and continue to be involved at that level in the running of the business. So yes, and I continue to sort of grapple with the issues associated with running a very hands-on business.
Oh, wow, Gary. So that's the different angle to you, which I don't know, and I'm sure many people won't know as well. That's great, Gary. So from the degree that you have to the mining, how long were you there as an investment analyst, Gary?
I was there for 2 years. I had started writing articles for publication in newspapers and magazines. I hadn't had many published when I spoke to the editor of a national magazine called The Bulletin, which was based in Sydney. That's sort of it's sort of, I suppose, equivalent to Time or The Economist, roughly. It was a very old. It was sort of about 100 years old at that point in time, and quite an institution. A federal politician called Jim Carlton was appointed as Minister for Health in the Australian government, and he asked me in 1982 if I would become his private secretary. So I joined his office for 10 months. There was an election the following year, and the Liberals lost, and at the same time I was asked by the new leader of the opposition in New South Wales, Nick Greiner, if I would join him to develop his policy agenda I should say in all of this, I never belonged to the Liberal Party. I was just sort of, I suppose, really a gun for hire because I'd been doing this analysis and this work with the sort of the new economic thinking. So that was the sort of underpinning. I worked with Greiner then for 5 years while they were in opposition, and then for 5 years with him in government. So I was with him for 10 years, developing a very large, bold reform agenda, and then overseeing the implementation of that once they came to government.
Is there any positive memories out of your 10-year association in building policies for the New South Wales government?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I was fortunate at a very young age to be able to make a huge difference. I was in that sense spoiled. I mean, I was working for a remarkable premier and a reforming premier. And when they came to government, they broke the cabinet office out of the premier's department, and I was appointed as head of the cabinet office with the brief to oversee the delivery of that sort of key elements of that agenda, and to manage the cabinet process and the way in which policy was ushered into and out of cabinet. So that was, and yeah, I mean, you know, there were a series of major initiatives at that time that I was right in the middle of. I mean, I had corruption had been a problem for the previous government, and I had, as head of research and policy, had overseen the research into corruption, but I'd also developed a proposal in some detail, to establish an independent commission against corruption, sort of a standing royal commission, and that was established when they came to government. I chaired the committee which designed it and drafted the legislation and so on. So that has since been copied by every other state government in Australia, and there's an active debate going on now about, and I think there's bipartisan agreement that there will be some kind of national body of that kind. So that was, you know, that's 3 decades ago. That work has continued to have its impact. And probably the other big area that I was doing at that I sort of pioneered myself and oversaw the implementation was the corporatisation of government business enterprises, which, unlike, I guess, the Thatcher government, which was around at the time in the UK, Greiner was less interested. He was a Harvard MBA, and he had been managing director of a large timber company. So he really sort of wanted to run government better. He wasn't a major, you know, sort of a mad privatiser. He did privatise the state bank and the state government insurance office, but he was much more interested in trying to transform the way that public enterprises were managed, and handed that brief to me, and I designed that agenda. And again, that was then followed across other governments of Australia. I did very little work on public service contracting or government contracting of any kind. Really no work on that in government. Although the work, the sort of conceptual framework that underlay my corporatisation work was deeply, it was grounded in property right theory, and that certainly has informed the way that I approach, at least the way I approach contracting, public service contracting and commissioning.
When did you decide to move to UK, Gary, and what triggered the journey to start Serco Institute and your journey from Australia to UK?
Yeah, so when I left government in the early 1990s, and I was in addition to having, you know, chairing a number of government inquiries and so on, I was on a number of public, private and not-for-profit boards. And I was approached by the then chief executive and one of the gang of four who founded Serco, who was in Australia sort of re-establishing the Australian business. One of the executives here had, unbeknown to me, had been following my career. And when I left government, there was some favourable publicity about the work I'd done in government. And he approached me and asked me if I would join the board of Serco Group, the parent board in the UK. And so I did. That was about, I guess, 1993. And late 1993, and I was fortunate to be on the board with the gang of four who created Serco. One of them retired not long after that. But so I was on the Serco board for 7 years. In addition to what the work I was doing here, I was flying back and forwards between Australia and the UK 5 or 6 times a year. Wow. And one of the projects that Richard White asked me to lead was a review of Labor's attitude to contracting. At the time, Labor were in opposition, and they were saying that they were going to stop all this. And obviously for a company like Serco, that was a bit of a worry. So I got to interview a number of the key players at the time, so David Miliband, Peter Mandelson, Jack Droney, as well as a number of others. And at the end of that, I guess I was there for a month interviewing people. My advice to the board was that Labor would continue to, contrary to what they were saying, Labor was going to continue contracting public services, but they would do it differently. So when Labor came to power, they did continue with it, and they were doing it differently. And Richard White asked me, would I move to the UK and change from a non-executive role to an executive one, advising the board. And within a couple of years, there was a new chief executive, and he revamped the Serco Institute, which had already been around for about 5 years. He revamped to shut it down and sort of restarted it, and asked me to take over as its director. So that's sort of how I wound up in the UK and ran the Serco Institute. The other, at the same time as as the new chief executive, Kevin Beeston and I were putting together the new institute, I worked with Kevin and Rod Aldrich, the then chief executive and one of the founders of Capita, and Digby Jones, who was then in charge of the CBI, to create what came to be called the Public Services Strategy Board, which was a committee of chief executives, about 15 chief executives from the public service sector, to create a collective voice to speak to government. And so I was intimately involved in designing and shaping that. My deputy at the Institute, John Williams, was seconded in to run the team inside the CBI. I wrote their first couple of reports, and I continued to serve as an advisor to that board until I left the UK in 2011 and came back to Australia. So I was in the fortunate position, in addition to working with Serco, the senior executives of Serco and senior government officials, I was also working with a number of the chief executives of the large and sort of interesting public service companies in the UK.
Let's continue a journey. And you went back to New South Wales and this chair of public service delivery role at Australian New Zealand School of Government, Gary. When did it all began, and you are still continuing that role?
I am, yes. Look, I decided in 2011, well, late 2010, I decided that public service contracting in the UK was not heading in a good direction.
Yes.
And I decided that it was time to head back home. And some former colleagues had played a role in establishing the Australian New Zealand School of Government. This body, known as ANZSOG, is its acronym. ANZSOG is owned by all of the governments of Australia and New Zealand, the national and state governments, and teaches an executive MBA to senior government officials from right across that area. So it's been a very successful model. And some of my former public service colleagues and academic colleagues have been involved in setting it up, and they'd been pressing me for some time to come back and take up a chair with ANZSOG. And when I decided it was time to come back, that was the direction that I took. My work here has been centred really around the commissioning of public services and not outsourcing. So that the process by which policymakers and funders of government agencies engage with delivery agents and delegate and hold accountable. But I've also published papers on the public service economy, on contestability, on public service contracting, when I have covered some of those areas as well. But the heart of my work has been focused on commissioning rather than contracting or outsourcing.
So what's the difference, Gary, for between commissioning, contracting and outsourcing in your own words?
Well, outsourcing is just one of the ways that you can contract. You might actually contract to insource. Outsourcing is the handing over of to an outsider of a function that you used to do internally. Contracts are used for a whole lot of other things. I mean, they're used, for example, for joint ventures. And there are various contractual tools that can be used in order to insource things. So it's one of my criticisms, and I've when I was over there last year, speaking at an Institute for Government event, I sort of had a bit of a go at this. I mean, the UK still very much uses the language and the framing of outsourcing. I think in government, at least, this is not the case in the private sector. In government, at least, outsourcing has a lot of ideological baggage. And I just think it makes it much more difficult for people to think in a very cool, rational way about what contracting is, when it works, how it works, and therefore when is it appropriate to use it, and what particular tools should you use, what version of contracting should you use. Commissioning is, it's really about delegation. I mean, the word is derived from a Latin term which means to delegate or entrust. I like the word entrustment. When you commission somebody to do something for you, you are entrusting a third party to do something for you. So if you think of the term, we use the term the Royal Commission or commissioned officers, or we commission research. That's how we're using the term. That's its origins. Contracting is a particular form of commissioning, but there are numerous other ways that we commission. So much of the work I've been doing since coming back has been looking at how do we better commission the public delivery of public services. Now, I've been borrowing a lot from the lessons from good and bad contracting, because contracting is a very robust form of commissioning. You are handing off to somebody with a legally binding contract, and that requires you to think through and work your way through solving a series of problems before you sign the contract. You do planning. And that process of engagement with external providers and then negotiating and signing a contract and then working together with a party slightly at arm's length, that whole process creates certain disciplines from which we can learn and adapt and improve the way in which we commission publicly provided public services. So as I said, you can talk about the commissioning of public services provided by private or not-for-profits, and I do work on that as well. But for me, the much more interesting question is the way in which we engage with and commission public service delivery from public providers and do that better than the way that we've traditionally done.
Wow, Gary, we will touch all those things, Gary, in a minute. But continuing the journey, Gary, so a lot of papers, a lot of publications at when you were there at ANZSOG, and you did come back to UK for the BSA report, Gary, and post-Caroline, you were also heavily involved in giving and sharing your insights, Gary. So can you share a little bit on those, Gary, and then we'll go back to finish what you have done on publications?
Yeah, so I continue to remain fairly deeply involved in the UK environment, I was going back twice a year, and did continue to do so up until just a couple of years ago, and was, on some occasions spending a month at a time. So I was still deeply engaged with people. I was going out and studying some of the new models, and learning huge amounts from the very the sort of innovation that was going on. In 2016, Mark Fox at the BSA asked me if I would do their annual lecture, which I did. And I before I wrote that lecture, I did a round, sort of visited a lot of colleagues and people sort of at the pointy end of the market in the UK, people who were, contract directors and so on, to talk about what was happening. And what I found was quite disturbing. And so the lecture I delivered, I think fairly gently or indirectly warned that I thought the industry was in danger of becoming politically and commercially unsustainable. This is 2016. Mark Fox then asked me if I would write a report to his board on the state of the UK market as I saw it. I spent a month in the UK, interviewed more than 80 people, most of them from industry, and in some cases I drilled down. I spoke to quite a number of chief executives, but I also, with several companies, got down to bid directors and contract directors, but I also spoke to politicians and special advisors and senior civil servants in this area and some union officials, and wrote what turned out to be a fairly blunt report, pointing out that while I wouldn't for a moment excuse the stupid mistakes that the private sector had made, at the end of the day, this is government supply chain, and if Ford stresses its supply chain so that cars get sent out of Ford's front gate and burst into flames, that's Ford's problem. And so as I said, while not excusing the private sector, I was deeply critical of government for having created the conditions where the market got to the place where it did. And of course, 9 months later, Carillion happened, and all of the other near disasters that followed then for the next 12 or 18 months. So that some people then came back to talk to me about the report I'd written 9 months before, warning that this is where things were going.
Wow, you just foresaw what's happening, Gary, and I do know I was there with you on few occasions there. Gary, 2016 from the report to now 2019, we did know that the government came back, and the outsourcing playbook and a few other things. What's your current view on, did the government learn from the debacle in 2016, Gary? Or did the private sector learn something from this, or are they still doing the same way?
No, look, obviously things have calmed down to some extent. There's been a serious clean out of the senior management of a number of the companies, and a more cautious approach has emerged. The playbook reads well. My concern always with the playbook was that I had read all of those words before in government reports for some years.
Yes.
And I sort of felt that it would be nice if they actually this time round learned. I am told that there is a second, a playbook version 2 is about to be released in the next few days.
Yep.
Yeah, which is interesting in the middle of the current environment that they would do that. I have to qualify my remarks by saying I was over there about this time last year, but I was not primarily involved in, other than doing an event for the Institute for Government. I didn't go out and do further research, so I'm relying on the comments of people who are involved rather than being able to go around and kick tires. I think there's been much better engagement with industry with the preparation of both playbooks and the stuff in between. I think ministers have been, we've had a couple of Cabinet Office ministers and their people have been better engaged, albeit distracted by Brexit and now with COVID. But nevertheless, there is, I think, a realisation that things need to work a bit better going forward. Having said that, I'm not convinced that the fundamental lessons have been learned in government, and I think government can and should have institutional memory. There is still too much of an inclination to think that this is primarily a tool for driving out cost or for driving down price, and not enough sensitivity to the complexities involved in balancing price and quality. And I think also there is still too much of an inclination to see contract management as primarily using financial incentives to squeeze. Contract management is, in fact, a very complex form of management that involves a whole lot of other things, and the people who actually do contract management down at the front line understand this. I don't know that the sort of policymakers and the people who sit up the top and the folks who preside over procurement and procurement policy are anywhere near enough sensitive to that. So, yes, things I think are better. I still worry about the sort of underlying policy settings, the underlying assumptions about what contracting is all about.
Gary, the Brexit now, as you know, outsourced playbook version 2, as you rightly said, is going to come out. And we have the opportunity now to just say, okay, there are many school of thought that said the OJU regulations from European Union, it's pretty cumbersome, it's pretty detailed, it's red tape. So we have the opportunity to do something different post-Brexit, and there are people working on it. What are some of the high-level advice you would give to people who are working on this Brexit procurement or commissioning guidelines as we speak, Gary?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I'm not across the fine detail. I have continually been told by colleagues in the UK who deal with this much more closely than I ever have, that the European procurement rules were never as much of a constraint as they were perceived, that there was an element of laziness to that.
Yes.
I mean, there is a good argument that that the UK shouldn't depart from those procurement rules any more than is necessary, because obviously, it's in everyone's interest for there to be vigorous competition both ways. Sort of departing from those rules for their own sake wouldn't be a wise course. And I think there was one of the reports I wrote for the CBI group was on competitive neutrality, and there are a lot of principles in European law that insist upon and drive in the direction of competitive neutrality between public and private sectors, and that's a two-way street. Sometimes the public sector is at a disadvantage compared to the private sector, and I think so I think there are aspects of European competition law that are worthy and deserve to be embraced. Yeah. The difficulty with a lot of these things, it's procurement rules generally, is that if it is approached as essentially a mechanical task, if part of commissioning is procurement design, it is sitting down and asking the question, what kind of a public service is this? What kind of a contractual relationship am I likely to need? And therefore, what kind of a contract do I want to design and create and negotiate? And then what kind of a procurement do I want to conduct that will take me in the direction of finding the right partner, the right kind of partner, creating the right kind of a partnership, and underpinning and laying the foundations for the kind of contractual relationship that I want there to be. That's a strategic approach, whereas there has been a tendency in the procurement industry, and the UK is not limited in this. This is a problem right around the world. The procurement people tend to get into a very formulaic, a process and just mechanically work through the process instead of stepping back and thinking strategically about what challenges they've got and how they tailor what tools they use in order to achieve the outcomes that they need to accomplish.
That's brilliant, Gary. Gary, do you suggest any resources for the procurement people and the commissioners, Gary, from your experience, including your books and your publications, Gary, so that they could refer? Top of your head.
Yeah, I haven't written as much as I should have. Because I spend so much time advising and indeed studying and learning. I've only really sort of written one piece myself on the history of commissioning and explaining where it came from. In the UK, it's a history of the evolution of this concept in the UK. The literature if you go looking for a literature on commissioning as such, it's frustrating. You get practical how-tos, which are okay, but they tend to be confined to a particular area, a particular field. You get academic publications which tend to be sort of teeth-sucking. They tend to sort of say, it's very difficult. There's lots of, there's different views on this, and, that's not terribly helpful. It's not a deep literature anyway. On the other hand, if you step back and look at the individual parts, the component parts that make up what's going on in commissioning, there's a huge literature. So, as I say, not terribly helpful for practitioners or even academics who are wanting to get in and think about this. So as I say, it's not easy to sort of turn up. If you go searching for commissioning as such, you're not necessarily going to be having lots of joy. But the component parts, as I say, there's some wonderful bodies of academic research and thought, and some practical studies which can be drawn upon. I'm just about to, once the lockdown ends, I'm about to commence a piece of research on a project I've been working on for five and a half years now here in New South Wales in the prisons space. The government here decided that rather than outsourcing a number, they've already got 2 prisons that are managed under contract, but rather than outsourcing several more, the government decided that they would market test one existing prison and allow an in-house team to bid. And they did that. I was chairing a commissioning advisory board. Cabinet appointed me to chair this commissioning advisory board in prisons, and the in-house team put in a wonderful bid, and they won. They beat the private sector.
Wow.
And they have been doing a wonderful job of running a substantially better and lower cost prison. It's both a more humane prison in that, for example, prisoners are out of cell for many more hours of the day, but also it is costing less. But the traditional way that Treasury and the Justice Department, corporate services people, and so on, and the rules generally interface with a publicly delivered public service makes it more difficult for them to do their job. And so we're about to begin quite an in-depth study interviewing the people who were involved in that to see how it happened, what happened, why it's gone so well, and what the lessons are for public service delivery more broadly. So that I think we need more of that kind of research, taking particular case studies, and in this case, as I say, it's not outsourced, but the contractual and competitive tools were used in order to commission this service from a public provider, and it's been, as I say, been a wonderful success story. Not perfect, because no one's perfect. So I think there needs to be more of that kind of in-depth analysis of interesting commissioning challenges and innovative solutions in order for us to begin to get a better idea about what's going on here, what is commissioning that is different from traditional delegation.
When did you enter the justice sector, Gary? And I know you also work across in Canada as well, Australia, UK, Canada, and many other countries. Any interesting memories from those experiences, Gary? How justice as the sector has been outsourced or insourced or commissioned in general across the globe?
Yeah. Well, the answer is historically, we've done this very badly across most of the English-speaking world. And I got involved in this just after we set up the Public Services Strategy Board within the CBI. The unions in the UK had been running an advertising campaign in the cinemas, amongst other places, where they would put up a photograph of a nurse holding a baby with her salary, and then they'd put up a photograph of one of the chief executives of one of the public service companies and their salary, suggesting that one of these is motivated by a sense of public service and is paid, a moderate amount of money. The other one is paid this exorbitant sum, and they're just interested in profits. And as I thought on that, I realised that it was actually a cheap trick, because what they were really contrasting, they were contrasting two things at once. One was public versus private, but the other thing they were contrasting was frontline versus back office, or frontline versus management. And no one in the public doesn't warm to bureaucrats or fat cats in government either. We all warm to the people who risk their lives or work long hours serving the public. And that's been, of course, even more apparent lately through COVID. The response in the UK around the NHS has been particularly powerful. We've had a similar response here, although since our death rates haven't been as high, it's not been quite as emotional. But just before we had the virus hit us, we'd had quite severe bushfires here in Australia, and we had firefighters, and including a lot of volunteer firefighters, who risked their lives, and some died, saving people. So that, there's this very strong warmth that we have as human beings for these people who serve the public in this way. And so it was a stunt. And I decided that what we needed to do was to do a study on an area where government had contracted the delivery of frontline services, and where government historically hadn't done a terrific job, and where contracting had generally worked. And the standout at the time was prisons. Historically, that had been a problem area, and the Blair government was explicitly using contracting to drive what it called its decency agenda. In other words, they weren't just wanting it cheaper or lower cost. They were wanting at the same time demanding a higher standard. And so I did some research then and pulled together a report for the CBI, and that was my sort of first foray into this. And typically, it's path dependence. Having written something on it, people keep coming back and ask, showing you another problem or asking you to speak on it. And it's an area I've come to be particularly, passionate about and interested in trying to see how we can commission the management of prisons better. And so, as I say, the work we're doing here in New South Wales isn't about outsourcing, although the government, both sides of politics, have outsourced, have contracted the management of a couple of prisons. Primarily what we're trying to do is to work out how we can better commission the public management of public prisons. On the second part of your question, yeah, I mean, I continue to be engaged in the UK. As I said, for some time, while I was sort of running, I would when I was over visiting, I would teach at the Cabinet Office's Commissioning Academy, and I advised one of the parliamentary inquiries into Carillion. So I've continued to be involved in a number of ways in the UK, and for the last 5 or 6 years have delivered a number of commissioning academies in Canada, and was back there again last year advising one of the provincial governments on the application of a commissioning framework to the sort of welfare to work, the job network, job placement field, which is done at provincial level there, and trying to sort of get them beyond a sort of a simplistic outsourcing or market mentality and thinking in a more sophisticated way about how they should design and engage with their supply chain in that area. So I've New Zealand, Ireland briefly, and then across Australia, I've worked with most state governments in Australia on these things, and continuing at the moment working with. Just had a session the other day. We've got a national Royal Commission into aged care going on here at the moment, and they've picked up my commissioning works, and have actually. I'm impressed. They've read it and watched my online lectures quite a bit, and so we were just talking through how to apply some of the principles in the aged care sector. So it's I'm sort of working community housing, child support, health support services. I mean, I've just worked across a wide range of sectors now, taking the mental health and so on, just working out what do we glean from this particular way of approaching the delegation and accountability problems and the system design problems. What can we learn for particular public services?
Gary, COVID-19, there is lots of kindness stories, positive stories, lots of collaboration stories. Do you think, from your opinion of, contracting, commissioning, whoever does the public service, business service, there'll be a lot more joined up collaboration that will be happening post COVID environment, Gary? Do you sense some sort of positive feeling?
The short answer is probably not. Let me give a slightly longer answer. Here in Australia, the Prime Minister has established a national cabinet with each of the state premiers on this national cabinet in order to work out a coordinated national response to the virus. Mm. And he's very enthusiastic, and there's lots of enthusiasm in different quarters about the governments of Australia working together in a more collaborative way going forward. Look, it'd be a nice thing. The thing is, the lesson is, and Britain had this experience in spades, when we face a crisis, when we face an external threat, we are capable of remarkable degrees of coordination, cooperation, sacrificing our priorities for the greater good. Mm. Once that external threat or that external crisis fades and weakens, we go back to having different priorities and seeing the world in different ways, which is a good thing. I mean, it's a very healthy thing that we all have different priorities in life. It's one of the great virtues of a free society. So while the other government that I spoke to about this was the New Zealand government after the horrific earthquake they had in Christchurch. some years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it was now, they were very enthusiastic about the lessons that they, about the cooperation that had gone on. And I was saying to them, look, there are lessons to be learned, but they're not the obvious ones. They're not the ones that are staring you in the face at the moment, because you've just had an horrific crisis and everyone will drop, people are prepared to bend the rules and come together. So yes, there are things we can learn out of this, but they won't be the obvious things. They won't be, this isn't easy. And there are reasons why governments wind up with lots of different departments and stakeholders competing and wrestling with each other to access scarce resources. Resources are scarce, people, money and time, all of those things are scarce. And in a free society, it is not only inevitable, it is desirable that we compete and have different views. And government is this sort of big, messy set of institutions by which we arrive at a compromise and some sort of agreement about where those scarce resources are going to get invested. So the answer is yes, there are lessons to be learned out of this, but most of the lessons people think they've learned in the short term are not going to be terribly helpful ones.
Wow, that's very powerful, Gary. Gary, in addition to contracting and commissioning, you also are in the process of writing some, and you also have written 1 or 2 books that are close to your heart, Gary. Do you mind sharing some of those?
Well, I've not written any books up until now. I've written lots of chapters in books, and I've written lots of reports, and I've written a number of articles. Most of my work most of my time is spent working alongside public servants, grappling with trying to solve a practical problem. And I would love to have had the time to sit down and write up the lessons. And as I said, we're just about to begin an in-depth research and writing project around this one I've been working on now for 5.5 years, because I think that badly needs to be. The book I have been working on for 25 years is a history of convict transportation to Australia, and particularly the early years. And that was all done by contractors, and particularly in the period up to 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The contractors were essentially the managers of the ship's officers, were the managers of floating prisons operating under contract from government. And it's a wonderful case study. I decided to start work on this years ago, partly because it's obviously a colourful example, partly because everyone in this is dead, and so I can be blunt and critical about people without needing to worry about being sued or sensitivities. It's just a great case study in good contracting and bad contracting. And it was mostly done well. It's something that I think the British people can be very proud of. It was mostly done well. So that I've been sort of working on that for 25 years. When we lived in the UK, I was there for 10 years. We were just around the corner from the National Archives, so I spent a lot of time drilling down into original source material. All of my stuff is coming up out of original sources, so it's a very in-depth study, and I'm now sort of I took some long service leave that was owing for me when the lockdown began, so I've been working flat out in getting that into its final form to go off to a publisher.
Perfect, Gary. Yeah, I'm so looking forward for the book, Gary. Every year I speak to you, there is always some progress on it, so don't be too harsh on yourself. It will come out soon. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Please do visit baachu.com/Baachu Talk podcast to this specific episode link to everything that was mentioned in this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and share Baachu Talk podcast with your loved ones. We will see you at the next episode with another special guest. Until then, it's Bhaskar Sundaram from Baachu signing off.